My hands were steady. That surprised me, honestly. You'd think after 38 years of building things with those hands, framing walls in January cold, pouring concrete in August heat, running wire through crawl spaces so tight you had to exhale just to move, you'd think they'd know how to stay still. But standing there in the back of that banquet room, holding a plain manila folder while my son-in-law finished his toast, I noticed how calm they were, like they already knew what was about to happen. He was still talking. I set the folder on the table beside my water glass and listened. The story really starts about 2 years before that night. My daughter, my youngest, the one who used to fall asleep on my chest watching Saturday Westerns, called me from Portland to say she'd met someone. She sounded the way she used to sound on Christmas morning, like the world had finally organized itself into something that made sense. His name was Trent. She said he worked in commercial real estate finance. He'd gone to Dartmouth. His family had a place on the Cape. She said all of this carefully, like she was reading from a list she'd prepared, and I understood what she was doing. She was giving me the version of him she thought I needed to hear. I told her I was happy for her. I meant it. My wife, Eleanor. We lost her 6 years ago to a stroke, fast and without warning, the way the worst things always are. She would have asked 1,000 questions. What does he like to eat? Does he make you laugh? What does he look like when things go wrong? Eleanor believed you could learn everything about a man from how he behaved when he was inconvenienced. She had a gift for that kind of reading. I just said, "Bring him to dinner." They drove up in October. I live out in the hill country west of Austin, on about 40 acres I bought in 1994 when land out there was still something a working man could afford. The house isn't grand. 3 bedrooms, a covered porch, a workshop out back where I spend most of my mornings. I'd painted the shutters that summer, replaced 2 sections of fence along the road. Place looked decent. Trent pulled in driving a leased Porsche Cayenne. I could tell by the sticker in the corner of the windshield, and he got out squinting at the property the way a man does when he's doing math in his head. My daughter hugged me for a long time. She smelled like the lavender soap she's used since college. I held on a little longer than usual. Trent shook my hand. Firm grip, practiced. He looked me over the way people do when they've already formed an opinion and are just checking to see if the evidence fits. I was wearing what I always wear, work boots, Wranglers, a flannel shirt with a frayed left cuff I kept meaning to replace. "Sir," he said, "great to finally meet you." "Come inside," I said. "Dinner's almost ready." I'd made brisket, had it in since 4 in the morning. There's a right way to do brisket, and it involves time and patience and not opening the lid every 20 minutes. I'd learned that from a man named Hector who ran a barbecue stand outside Kerrville back in the 80s, and I'd never forgotten it. Trent sat down at the kitchen table and looked at his phone. My daughter talked about the drive, about a podcast they'd listened to, about a restaurant in Portland that had a 6-month wait list. Trent looked up occasionally to confirm details. He had the particular confidence of someone who'd never had a plan fall apart on him. Over dinner, he asked what I did. "Construction," I said. "Like contracting? Development," I said. "I build things. Sometimes I hold on to them." He nodded the way people nod when they're not really listening. "My firm does a lot of work with developers," he said. "Mostly institutional clients. Mid-market's been pretty brutal lately with the rate environment." "It has," I agreed. He seemed mildly surprised that I knew what he meant. Later, he walked around the living room looking at the photographs on the wall. There's one of me on a job site in 1989, 26 years old, standing on a steel beam 4 stories, up with nothing behind me but sky. There's one of Eleanor and me at our first house, a 1,200-square-foot place in San Marcos that I framed myself on weekends while working full-time during the week. There's one of my daughter at 8 years old sitting on a concrete foundation I'd just poured, wearing my hard hat. Trent looked at them without comment. At the end of the night, when they were getting ready to leave, he shook my hand again and said it had been a pleasure. He said they'd have to have me up to Portland sometime. He said it the way people say things they don't intend to arrange. In the driveway, my daughter squeezed my arm and whispered, "He's just a little reserved at first." I told her I understood. I watched the Cayenne back out and head down the road, and I stood there until the taillights disappeared. I didn't say anything to her then. There wasn't anything useful to say. They got engaged the following spring. My daughter called me crying. happy crying, the kind that comes in waves, and I sat on the porch steps and listened to her describe the proposal, which had happened at a restaurant in Napa with a view of the vineyard and a ring that had been his grandmother's. It was a beautiful story. I told her so. The wedding planning started immediately. They wanted a venue in the hill country. Ironic, given that Trent had barely looked at the hills when he was standing right in the middle of them, and my daughter asked if I would help with the costs. I said yes, of course. What I didn't say, and what she didn't ask, is that I'd been quietly covering most of the expenses from the start. The engagement party at the private club in Portland, which ran to $11,000, the save-the-date design and printing, the deposits on the florist, the photographer, the band. Each time, she'd mention a cost and I'd say, "Send me the invoice." She assumed, I think, that I was stretching, that I was doing what a loving father does when he reaches a little further than is comfortable. She didn't know about the accounts. She'd never asked to know. I'd always lived the same way I'd lived when I was broke, because for the first 10 years I was. You build habits in hard times and they stick. I drove a 12-year-old F-250 with 180,000 miles on it. I ate breakfast at the same diner I'd been eating at since 1991. I wore the same boots until the soles gave out. Eleanor had been the same way. We used to joke that you couldn't tell us from the people we'd started out as, and we meant it as a compliment to ourselves. My daughter knew I was comfortable. She didn't know the scope. Trent, I think, assumed he understood exactly what I was. The wedding venue was a property outside Fredericksburg. Limestone walls, live oaks, a creek that ran along the south edge, 212 acres. The owners had converted an old ranch into an event space, ceremony pavilion, reception hall, 6 guest cottages. What Trent didn't know, what nobody had thought to mention, was that I'd looked at that property 18 months earlier, had come close to making an offer, knew the owners professionally, had in fact referred them to the contractor who'd built the pavilion. I said nothing about this when my daughter showed me the website. I just looked at the photographs and said it was beautiful, which it was. The rehearsal dinner was at a steakhouse in Fredericksburg. Trent's parents had flown in from Connecticut. His father was a retired attorney. His mother had done something in nonprofit arts management. They were pleasant people, careful in the way that certain kinds of well-raised people are careful. They thanked me for hosting. His father shook my hand and said Trent had told them I was in construction, and he said it with the faint emphasis that people sometimes put on words they're not quite sure how to hold. I told him I'd been in it a long time. He said, "Good steady work." "It has been," I said. Trent gave a toast at the rehearsal dinner. He thanked his parents, thanked his friends, thanked my daughter for being the extraordinary woman she was. He mentioned briefly that he was grateful to her family for their support. He didn't look at me when he said it. My daughter caught my eye across the table. I smiled at her. The wedding day was clear and cool, the way October days in the hill country can be when everything lines up right. My daughter was married under the live oaks at 4 in the afternoon, and she was so beautiful, it made my chest hurt in a way I don't have good words for. Eleanor should have been there. That's the only thought I let myself have about that, and I had it once and then I put it away. The reception moved inside as the sun went down. The band played. People danced. I sat at the family table and talked to my son, my oldest, who'd driven down from Dallas with his wife and their 2 kids, and I felt, for a few hours, like everything was as it should be. Then came the toasts. Trent's best man went first. College stories, the expected jokes, genuine affection. Fine. Then Trent himself stood up. He started well. He talked about my daughter, about when he knew, about the life he wanted to build with her. He had a way with words. I'll give him that. And the room was warm and attentive. Then he shifted. He said he wanted to acknowledge the people in this room who had made this day possible. He thanked his parents. He thanked his friends. He looked around the room with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes he's earned his place in it. Then he looked at me. He said, and I am giving you the exact words because I have turned them over in my head many times since, he said, and of course to my father-in-law, a hard-working man, salt of the earth, the kind of guy who spent his whole life swinging a hammer so his daughter could have a day like this. He paused for effect. We appreciate the contribution, he said, modest as it was. He lifted his glass. The room lifted their glasses. I sat still. My son beside me went very quiet. I felt him look at me. I put my hand on his arm once, just briefly, and I stood up. Trent was already moving away from the microphone stand, handing it to the DJ, turning to kiss my daughter. I walked toward the front of the room, slowly, the way I walk on job sites when something's wrong and I don't want anyone to panic. I picked up the microphone. "I'd like to say a few words," I said. The room settled. My daughter turned from Trent with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between concern and curiosity. Trent looked at me with the comfortable expression of a man who doesn't expect to be surprised. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out a folded piece of paper. "I want to start by saying that today has been one of the best days of my life," I said. "Watching my daughter become a wife, watching her be so happy, there isn't a number I could put on what that's worth to me." I unfolded the paper, but Trent mentioned contributions, and since we're being specific, I read from the paper. Not everything, just enough. The venue deposit, $48,000. The catering contract, $61,000. The band, the flowers, the photographer, the guest cottages where his parents and their friends were sleeping tonight. $37,000 combined. The rehearsal dinner, $11,400. I read each number the way I read line items on a construction budget. Evenly, without drama. The room was very quiet. "The total for this weekend," I said, "comes to approximately $212,000, which I was glad to spend, every dollar of it." I refolded the paper, looked at Trent. "I didn't mention this before now," I said, "because it wasn't necessary. A father pays for his daughter's wedding because he loves her, not because he wants credit." But since the word modest came up, I paused. I wanted to make sure everyone had accurate information. I set the microphone down on the table. The room stayed quiet for another moment. Then my son started clapping, then other people, then most of the room. Trent stood very still. His face had done something I hadn't seen it do before. It had gone uncertain, like a man who's just stepped onto what he thought was solid ground and felt it shift. My daughter looked at me. Her eyes were bright. She wasn't smiling yet, but she wasn't crying either. She looked like she was figuring something out in real time. I sat back down. My son leaned over and said quietly, "Dad, I know," I said. "How much did you actually spend?" "More than that," I said, but the rest wasn't relevant to the point. What I hadn't read from the paper, what I'd decided, in the moment, wasn't necessary, was the fuller context. The reason I could spend $200,000 on a wedding weekend without rearranging a single account. I'd started in construction the same way most men do in Texas in the early 80s, working for someone else, learning the trade with my back and my hands, saving everything I could. By the time I was 30, I had enough to bid my first commercial job, a small medical office building in San Marcos, 12,000 square feet. I made a reasonable profit and put it into a second project, then a third. By the time my daughter was born, I had a small portfolio and a reputation for finishing on time and under budget, which in the development world is rarer than it should be. I never stopped working the sites. That was Eleanor's doing, partly. She believed you couldn't manage what you didn't understand, and partly my own stubbornness. I liked the smell of fresh concrete. I liked watching a building rise. I still do. By the time my daughter was in high school, I owned 14 commercial properties across Central Texas, office buildings, a small strip of medical facilities, 2 apartment complexes I'd converted from underperforming light industrial. I'd also started doing deals with partners, equity arrangements, preferred return structures, the kind of thing that generates income without requiring you to show up anywhere. I don't talk about this because I see no reason to. Money that announces itself is money that has something to prove. Eleanor and I raised our kids in the same house I'd built when they were small. We drove practical vehicles. We took vacations to state parks. We were, by every visible measure, a regular family. What we were, by every financial measure, was not. 3 days after the wedding, my daughter called me from their hotel room. They were still in Fredericksburg, using up the honeymoon suite I'd booked as a gift. She said, "Dad, what was that?" "Which part?" I said. She was quiet for a moment. "He said that to embarrass you. I know. And you." "I just corrected the record," I said. "That's all, Dad." Her voice had shifted. "How much? I mean, the number you read, that was accurate." Another silence. I could hear the ceiling fan in her room turning. "There's more, isn't there?" she said. It wasn't a question. "There's more," I said. She took a breath. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I thought about Eleanor, about the 1,200-square-foot house in San Marcos, about the things we'd decided, together, about what to teach our children and what not to. Because it wasn't yours to worry about, I said. You were supposed to learn to make your own, which you did. She didn't say anything for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was different, softer, more careful. He's embarrassed, she said. He should be, I said. Not because of what he didn't know, because of why he didn't know. He didn't ask because he'd already decided what I was. She didn't argue with that. Trent called me himself 2 days later. I was in the workshop when my phone rang, cutting a piece of cedar for a set of shelves I'd been meaning to build since spring. I turned off the saw and sat on a stool and listened to him apologize. He was good at it, I'll say that. He was specific and he was contrite, and he didn't make excuses, which I respected. He said he'd been arrogant. He said the word straightforwardly, without softening it, and that told me something about him that the rest of the weekend hadn't. I told him I accepted his apology. I told him something else, too. I told him that I didn't care about the money, not in the way he might think, and that I didn't care what he thought of me personally. I'd spent 40 years building things that would outlast me, and I'd done it without needing anyone's approval, and that wasn't going to change. What I cared about, I told him, was my daughter, and what I wanted him to understand, not as a threat but as a fact, was that she'd grown up watching her parents live a life built on honesty and hard work and respect for people regardless of what they owned. That was her inheritance, the only one that mattered, and if he wanted to build a life with her, he needed to understand what he was actually marrying into. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Yes, sir. I don't know yet who Trent is going to be. People change. Sometimes they don't. I've known men who were humbled by a moment like that and became better for it. And I've known men who smiled through the conversation and went back to exactly who they were before. Time is the only reliable test for that. What I know is this. My daughter called me the next morning, not to talk about Trent, not to explain or defend, just to talk. About the property outside Fredericksburg which she'd loved, about a hiking trail she'd found on their last morning there, along the creek, about how she wanted to bring her kids back someday, if she had them, and show them the live oaks. She asked me if I thought it was a beautiful piece of land. I told her I'd looked at it seriously once, that I'd almost bought it. She laughed, really laughed, the way she used to as a kid, surprised out of it, and said, "Dad, of course you did." We talked for almost an hour, about nothing important, about everything that was. When we hung up, I went back to the workshop and finished the shelves. Cedar has a particular smell when you're cutting it, clean and sharp and a little sweet. I'd been working with wood since I was 17 years old, when a man named Augusto let me sweep his shop in exchange for letting me watch him work. He was in his 60s then, lean and unhurried, and he told me once that the best things you build aren't the ones that impress people. They're the ones that last. I sanded the last shelf until it was smooth, set it against the wall, stepped back and looked at it the way I always do when something is finished, checking the level, checking the joints, seeing if it's true. It was.